First of all, a piece of housekeeping. Can you all hear me all right? Yeah, that was a unanimous yes? Excellent. Okay. David, we'll get to politics soon enough, but I want to begin with you. You have a New York political background, a growing up in New York that was not especially happy at all moments. And I'd like for you to begin by telling us about the environment in which you grew up in New York, the political aspect of it, and also the personal dynamic in the home.
Well, first of all, let me say how honored I am to be with you. It's a little bit daunting to sit with a guy who's written such brilliant books, and I've only written the one.
It's a good start. Thank you.
But I know this isn't the case. I have the feeling that you do this for sport in your free time, that you just dash off brilliant books.
Yeah,
but
it's easy as that.
No, I'm very much a product of New York, as New Yorkers would say. PS 40, Junior High School 104, Stuyvesant High School. I think some of my friends from Stuyvesant High School may be here tonight. And PS 40, yeah, there we go. And Junior High School 104. And I grew up in Stuyvesant Town. My parents moved there like many did after World War II. My father was a veteran. And my mother worked. My mother actually started as a newspaper reporter in the 40s at PM, which some of you may remember.
Which had no ads.
No ads. It was a philosophical decision on their part not to have any ads.
And lasted about a year, I think.
Right, yeah. Philosophical decisions sometimes are costly.
Yeah.
But it was a great paper, and she worked there, and she went on, and she was a freelance journalist, went to work in advertising. My father was a psychologist. And when my mother was at work, there was a woman who used to take care of me named Jessie Berry, who was this magnificent woman, African-American woman, had very little education, came up from the South, took care of other people's kids so she could take care of her own. And one day in 1960, and I know the exact day, it was October 27th, 1960, she said that she had learned that John F. Kennedy was coming to Stuyvesant Town, and she took me over there, put me on a mailbox so I could see. I watched 20th Street fill in, vast boulevard. I was used to the whizzing of traffic, and now it was filled with people. And this red-haired young senator jumped up on the platform and started speaking, and his voice was booming off the buildings, and everybody was transfixed. And, I was 5, so my understanding was limited. But what I did understand was this seemed very important to me and very exciting. It's really, I think it's the seminal event, the thing that got me going in...
Was there politics in the House?
Yeah, I mean, there were discussions of politics in the House. And my parents were, they were avid readers of the paper.
And they were what, Roosevelt Democrats?
Yes.
Or to the left in that,
absolutely, they were. They, like a whole generation of people, they grew up and they felt like Roosevelt had saved the country and my mother had, there was actually no president after Roosevelt in her view. So there was that, but I really was motivated that day and after, and I followed Kennedy, all things Kennedy after that, and as early as I could read, I started reading newspapers and following events. When Kennedy was assassinated, I sat in front of the television with morbid fascination. When his brother came to Stuyvesant Town, I went to work, as a little volunteer, handing out leaflets. I tried to become the strategist, but they weren't interested in that. And when I was 10, I made a big decision. Speaking of philosophical decisions, I crossed the aisle and worked for John Lindsay, who was running for mayor of New York. Abe Beame was the Democratic candidate for mayor. I thought he was kind of a hack.
Kind of a hack.
Yeah. Now, don't ask me how a 10-year-old makes that judgment.
It might be retrospective.
But Lindsay, you know what it was, and this is what writing a book is a great exercise in a memoir because it causes you to think about things in a different way. And I realize, John Kennedy, when he was there that day, I learned later from Google, which no one could imagine that day, said, I don't run on the platform that says if you elect me, everything will be good. Being an American citizen in the 1960s is a hazardous occupation, and it's filled with challenge and hope, and we'll decide which path we take. And the message was that we are not sort of at the mercy of history. We can make a difference. We can tilt the wheel. And he thought that way. And I was attracted to politicians who thought big, who had big ambitions for the community, for the country. So though, John Lindsay was a liberal Republican, if you want to know what one looks like, there's a natural history museum down here. I think they have some stuff and on display. But he also was a guy who had big ambitions for New York, and I was attracted to that. I actually, and on the same basis, I think the next year the Democratic nominee was a guy named Frank O'Connor, who was the city council president, also a hack. And so I went up and tried to volunteer for Nelson Rockefeller. A friend and I went up. They didn't know what to do with 11-year-olds. And finally they said, how'd you like to meet Jackie Robinson? And so Jackie Robinson was working for Nelson Rockefeller. That was the sum total of my involvement in that campaign, but it was enjoyable.
It was transformative. Yeah.
It was. And then when Bobby ran for president when he was 13, and I think one of the friends who is here was someone I went up to hand out leaflets with for Bobby Kennedy. I was totally absorbed in that race. So my political juices were very much flowing. The 60s were such a dramatic time. And if you ever, you didn't need any sort of prodding to believe that politics mattered in the 1960s. The issues were so big and so dramatic.
And for you, even very early, what was the issue that was firing up your imagination?
Well, civil rights.
Maybe
it was because of Jesse. Maybe it was because of sensibilities that my parents imparted. The civil rights movement was very moving to me. And that was something that I followed very closely. And I should say parenthetically that I think about Jessie a lot and what she would have thought if she knew that the little boy she put on the mailbox ended up working for the first African-American president. And it does reflect the fact that however the road winds, we do make progress as a country because that would have been an unthinkable prospect. By the way, I had the honor of sitting with Jon Stewart tonight when on the show in which he announced that he was leaving, and I said, I wonder what Jessie would have thought, and Jon said, I'm sure she would have been very disappointed. So I'm going to miss that guy. So.
I think we all are. Now, this was not an easy home. You had a tough time.
Yeah. My parents didn't have a very happy marriage. My father was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, and for a lot of the early part of his life, he was kind of a drifter. He came here when he was 12 from what was then Bessarabia, and the first American kind of thing that he embraced was baseball. And he became a great pitcher, and all-city pitcher by the end of high school, and got a scholarship to college. But after college, kind of drifted around for a while. My grandfather opened up a shoe store in Brooklyn, and they lived in Seagate. And my mother was from a family in Jersey City, a Jewish family. My grandfather was an immigrant, worked as a butcher, and put his way paid his way through dental school, and he was my dentist, and I often thought that he never quite lost some of the habits of his old profession when he was working on my mouth. But he they would in the summers, as many Jewish families would, they went to Seagate to be on the ocean, and my mother and father met on the beach, and she was terribly driven, as driven as a freight train, and he was anything but driven, and I think she saw in him a project, and he saw in her maybe some ballast. but it never was a very good relationship, and they tried a few times to make it work. But really, for most of my early life, you know, they were estranged. They finally got divorced when I was 13. And my mother was very much, she went into advertising. She actually was one of the pioneers in qualitative research, focus groups. Her skills as a reporter translated very well to that, to probing and finding out what people were thinking. Something that actually, these are skills that she, you know, emphasized to me, and it helped me in reporting, but also later in politics, I became a great devotee of that. But she was very much about her career and didn't have a whole lot of time for me. And so some of the friends who were here and other friends in Stuyvesant Town really became kind of they were my family, and we kind of looked after each other. I realized when I was writing the book, one of the reasons why I feel so comfortable in campaigns and in newsrooms is I love these communal settings where, you know, when I started working, and I don't want to jump ahead in the story, but I started working at the Chicago Tribune right after college, and my father had passed away, and I lived, and the newsroom became my family. And campaigns, to me, are like families. And now I've started this Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. I feel the same way about that.
The first time I met you, we talked about your life at the Chicago Tribune a bit and your eventual dissolution with the whole business of what was going on. I know that the Tribune had changed ownerships and it only got worse as time went by. But was the actual work of reporting something that you got disenchanted with?
No. I loved being a reporter. I loved journalism. I got disenchanted. You know, for the first 6 years I was at the Tribune, it was sort of the old front page crowd. It was you know, everybody was really excited and about stories. Your editors were as excited as you are, and they took great pleasure in throwing big shots out when they came in to complain, and it was just you know, it was a bunch of iconoclasts trying to put out a great newspaper, and I loved it. Then sort of the green eye shade guys moved in. They wanted bigger margins on the paper. They brought in their own editorial team, and the attitude, instead of having editors who encouraged you and rewarded good work, the attitude of the new editors was kind of, there are 1,000 people who want your job, so you don't need a pat on the back. We can always get someone else to do it. And the news hole started to shrink, and judgments, it seemed to me, were being made more on a business basis than on an editorial, on a news basis. And I kind of decided that I love journalism so much I didn't want to do it that way. And Paul Simon was a senator from Illinois, or a congressman from Illinois running for the Senate.
Right.
Great guy. Some of you may remember him. Paul was sort of the Orville Redenbacher of American politics. He had a bow tie and horn-rimmed glasses, big ears, like noticeably big ears. We used to talk about Paul Simon's plan for global domination. But really an honorable guy. You know, he came from Southern Illinois, very much a part of the South, and bought a paper when he was 19 years old, and this was one of the bonds between us, and used it to crusade against a local crime syndicate. And he tried to get someone to run against them for their candidate for prosecuting attorney. Everybody was afraid to do it. So he ran for the legislature at 21 and got elected. And went to the legislature and was a big reformer in the Illinois legislature in the 1950s, which took courage because there weren't a lot of reformers in the Illinois legislature. And in fact, there still aren't a lot of reformers in the Illinois legislature. But he also was a great advocate for civil rights from a southern district. And so I went to work for him. And that
got you launched.
That got me, I made the transition.
So in the mid-90s, along comes this neophyte, this guy who decides to run for the Illinois legislature. And he wins in large measure by knocking someone off the ballot because she doesn't have the signatures. So an incumbent who was going to stay out and then come back in.
Yes.
He played a little hardball, legal hardball, gets into the legislature, and is a little bit of an oddball. He's not really tied in to the Chicago black left. In fact, those guys can't stand him. He's friendly with whites and blacks, kind of either in the center or center right and center left. His wife can't stand the fact that he's commuting between Chicago and Springfield. And he's starting to struggle. He makes a little bit of an impact, but nothing earth-shattering. And then he loses a congressional race to Bobby Rush. He doesn't lose, he gets crushed. Crushed. And Michelle Obama really does not want him to continue in politics. They want to do good and do well. And
Or at least good and pay the bill.
Exactly.
Yes.
And at a certain point, they basically make a deal, a marital deal. Up or out.
Right.
I'm going to run for Senate.
Right.
And you think it's nuts. Maybe he should.
Well, let me talk a little bit about this.
Hang on. I'm going to. And because
you wrote a great book on all this.
I got a feeling you have no idea how bizarre this is. People forget. He runs for Senate, and his opponents in the Democratic side peel away, and there are sex scandals, and he suddenly emerges. He wins the Democratic side. Then he runs against he's got a Republican candidate who's very attractive. Sex scandal, drops out, and he runs against
Alan Keyes.
Alan Keyes, who's not exactly.
Well, what happened was the Republican Party saw that Obama had become a phenomenon, and their bright idea was, we need an African-American candidate too, so we'll go to Maryland and get this guy to come and run for the Senate.
I don't think he knew where O'Hare Airport was.
Although he found it pretty quick after the election.
Departure terminal. Now, it's an amazing story.
It is. Let me just back up a little bit on this and talk a little bit about my early experiences with Obama. All the history you recite is true. By the way, as you spoke,
a cartoon.
It is a. It struck me as you were talking that I must just be attracted to politicians with big ears. That's, I think, the first thing. But what happened was in 1992, a friend of mine named Betty Lou Saltzman, who's kind of a doyen of liberal politics, called me and said, I just met the most remarkable guy. I think you ought to meet him. And I said, Betty Lou, I'm happy to meet anybody you want me to meet, but why do you want me to meet this guy? She said, I think he may be the first black president of the United States.
And at
1992, he had just come back from law school.
He hadn't even run for the legislature.
Nothing. And I always say that now whenever I go to the track, I take Betty Lou with me. And she's got a tremendous knack for picking winners. But I went and I met Barack. We had lunch. And what struck me was he was, plainly bright, well motivated. I was really struck by the fact that here was a guy who had been the editor of the Harvard Law Review, could have written his ticket at any corporation, any law firm in America, and been set for life, and came back instead to run a voter registration drive, to work in a civil rights firm, did some teaching at the University of Chicago. But it was clear to me, I believe the world of politics divides into two categories. And the first is the more numerous, and that is the people who want to be something. And then there's a smaller category of people who want to do something, who see running for office as a means of achieving some public good. He was plainly in that second category, and I was impressed by him. Didn't leave, as I said in the book, humming "Hail to the Chief." But he was clearly someone to watch. And I didn't work with him throughout the 90s. As you say, he ended up, we don't have to go through all the history, but he did play some hardball to get
And the people he worked with in those first offices were, running campaigns out of a car. I mean, this was not big-time David Axelrod politics.
No, and in fact, well, let's fast forward ahead. Because it was an interesting juncture in both our lives in 2002. I had been a pretty successful political consultant for almost 20 years, but I had reached this point where I had become kind of disillusioned with political consulting and campaigns, and part of it had to do.
Why is that?
Well, because the thing that was the precipitating event was I had a client in the 90s named Rod Blagojevich. You guys may know the name. you know what? Wherever I go,
Love him.
I could be anywhere in the world and say that, and I get the same reaction. I worked for him when he was a legislator running for Congress. But he came to me in 2001 and said he wanted to run for governor. And I was kind of appalled by that because I liked Rod. I thought he was.
Why?
I liked him because he had good spirit and a real sense of identification with working class people, and that was very clear to me. He was bright. He was, he actually in the Illinois legislature.
You didn't sense the worst at any point.
Oh well, no, I didn't. Although, I wrote in the book that. In 1996, when he was running for Congress and I was working for him, the Tribune was doing a profile of his father-in-law, who was a ward committeeman for the national convention that was coming. They wanted to do a profile of a ward boss. And as part of it, they assigned a bunch of reporters to look at Rod. And they wanted to make the case that he was a ghost payroller and all that. And I had to spend a lot of time doing my own investigative reporting to persuade them that that wasn't the case. With the subsequent events, I thought back to that and thought, did I miss something? Was I trying too hard to find exculpatory information when, in fact, But in any case, he also was very kind to my son, who was going through some problems at the time. Teenager, went and lived in Washington, worked for Rod as an unpaid intern in the summers. Rod was very kind to him. I liked him, but when he came and said he wanted to run for governor, I was appalled by it. That's a big job, that's a real job. and I said, well, why? Why do you want to run for governor? And he said, well, you can help me figure that out. And I said, look, if I have to help you figure it out, you shouldn't run. And that was sort of the end of our relationship. But he went out and he hired a very fine political consulting firm, and they applied all the state-of-the-art techniques. And he ran. The last governor was in legal trouble, ended up going to prison as well. George Ryan. I'm not painting a very nice picture of the land of Lincoln here.
No.
So Rod ran as a reformer in that race. And he was running against a conservative attorney general, Republican, who was a fine guy. Didn't agree with him on a lot of stuff, but a high character guy. But it was like watching Elmer Fudd and Bugs Bunny. I mean, Rod was just running circles around him. And I realized he was going to be the governor. And I found that depressing because I knew that there was something wrong here and that this was a very cynical campaign. So I was going through my own existential crisis when Barack called and said he was doing an up or out thing, and he promised Michelle. And he asked me to work for him for the United States Senate. I had been asked by several other candidates who were running, who were better funded, better known, but I said to my wife, Susan, who's here tonight, if I could help Barack get elected to the U.S. Senate, that would be something that I could be proud of for the rest of my life. And I signed up, and we went around with our tin cup trying to persuade people that he could win the race, and that was the beginning of our association.
And
And by the way, I just want to say, David, it is true. Everything you said about those races is true.
But
he did not win the Senate race because of the sex scandal in the primary. We were on the way up, and Hull was on the. No, I understand that. No, look, it's not lost on me that the odds of 2 sex scandals in the same campaign are long. So, the 2004 campaign for the U.S. Senate, in which Yes We Can came to be, was as uplifting and as exciting a race as either of the presidentials in many ways, and there was a great innocence to it. He took the state by storm.
What did he have then? What did he not have then as a political candidate that he would have a little later? In other words, what skills were in place, what talents were in place, and what wasn't there yet?
What he had, I remember so clearly getting a call early in the campaign. He was campaigning in deep southern Illinois, near where Paul Simon had been from. And I got a call from the young man who was traveling with him. And he said, hey, we had a great day down here. And I'm like, really? And when I talked to Obama that night, because we would talk every night, he said, I said, gee, I was surprised to hear that. He said, why? I said, I don't know, a black guy named Barack Obama from the south side of Chicago in deep southern Illinois, at a VFW hall. I just thought it could be challenging, And he said, no, you don't get it. These folks are just like my grandparents from Kansas. We get to talking about, my father's service in General Patton's army and my mother's service as a Rosie the Riveter, a grandmother's service, my grandfather and grandmother's service as Rosie the Riveter, and we have a great time. And I had this realization that here's a guy who felt comfortable in any room he walked in. He could be there, he could be in an inner city church, he could be in a Tony parlor in the suburbs, and wherever he went, he took people as they came. He was comfortable. He made people feel comfortable. So that was there. As a speech maker, he was uneven. Oftentimes he would talk over people's heads. We had a talk about that because he'd call me at night and he'd tell me all these compelling stories about people he met, and then I'd hear his speech and none of that was there. And I said, you know what, you should animate your speeches with these stories. And he began to do that. And of course, he's a great writer. He's a great storyteller. When he started animating his speeches with stories, they became very, very powerful. So that evolved over the course of that campaign. And then, of course, was the big sort of event in his evolution, which was that convention speech in Boston.
Now, the personality to me is, there's a riddle to it. If you were to listen to a lot of political opponents, and even people who've, not least New York elites and Washington elites, they're mystified by his personality. In other words, they see someone who has this tremendous talent, but whose who's a reluctant seducer. And there's the kind of Acela conventional wisdom that if Barack Obama only exerted his powerful personality and powers of personal persuasion, whether on the golf course or at the dinner table, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You hear this on Joe Scarborough on every morning.
I've actually been there and heard it.
Exactly, exactly. That we would have a kind of new Rooseveltian age.
Joe always says, we had a great relationship with Bill Clinton. I always have to remind him, hey, you impeached him.
Right.
Okay. How do you treat people you don't have a great relationship with? There's a bit. First of all, there is the Clinton overhang. There's this feeling that Bill Clinton, had that capability. I remember 2 very miserable years of his presidency when he started out, and it is. So I think it's sort of a myth that we were like one glass of wine, one game of golf, one beer, one pat on the back away from peace and harmony in Washington.
But David, even more seriously, you hear this about foreign leaders, that the relationships with foreign leaders tend toward correctness. When it comes to Angela Merkel, maybe a little bit more warmth, although that might have been spoiled by the NSA scandal.
Yeah, I think it's been restored.
Thanks to Vladimir Putin.
Yes.
But there's not.
Yes, he's created a reset.
Yes, right. So there is not that. There's not Clinton and Helmut Kohl. There's not George Bush and Gorbachev, George Bush the elder. Is there something lacking there, or is this is the person, this is who he is?
Well, I think he does have productive relationships with them. I can't speak to the quality of those relationships. What I can speak to is sort of the situation in Washington. And and I wrote in the book, I think that everybody's strength is their weakness. Obama's strength is that he doesn't believe elections are the most important thing. He does believe that you're there and you have an opportunity and you should make a difference. There's a little bit of a disconnect because about 80% of the people in Washington do believe the election is the most important thing. And yes, they want to get things done. I tell a story in the book about his talk to the Democratic caucus on the Senate, in the Senate on the Hill around health care. And he made one of the best speeches, extemporaneous speeches I've ever heard him give, in a closed-door session with them about why this was important. We got back in the car to go to the White House, and he turned to me and said, "What are they so scared of?" I said, "Well, I think they're scared of losing their jobs." And he said, well, what's the point of being up here for 30 years if you never do anything? And I said, you know what? I think that's okay with a lot of them. I said, I think that they would love to get things done if they could, if they can, but not necessarily at the expense of losing their seats. And actually, I think that Chuck Schumer articulated that view not long ago, that, gee, healthcare was really good, but it was really politically costly. Well, Obama has a completely different view, but the flip side of that is, I think in his relations with individual politicians, he can sometimes come across as lecturing. And I think that's true also sometimes with foreign leaders. When he sees the opportunity to do something historic and good, and the other person isn't seizing it because they have political concerns, he doesn't process that well.
Look, we're at the
or he'll tell them what their political
we're at the
concerns are.
92nd Street Y, so I'm going to take a flyer that maybe some people here are interested in this question. One particular relationship with a foreign leader is a disaster.
Yes.
A disaster. And,
Yes.
and it's only gotten worse in the last 6 weeks, 4 weeks, and that's with Benjamin Netanyahu. How did we get to this point, and from both sides?
Well,
by the way, I believe Netanyahu called you and Rahm Emanuel self-haters. So,
self-hating Jews, yeah.
well, that's what I mean.
Yeah. My reaction to that was, no, I hate Rahm, not myself. But, from the very beginning, the president put pressure on Netanyahu over settlements. That got the relationship off to a
uneasy start.
Right.
Yeah.
And we should point out that Netanyahu also had bad relationship with Bill Clinton, which cost him the prime ministership in the 90s. So there was some history of this. This is a classic case, though, and you raise it in the right context. President feels a sense of urgency about a two-state solution, feels that time is the clock is ticking, the opportunity can pass, and he doesn't see the alternative long-term for Israel's survival as a democratic Jewish state. Could happen, but he doesn't see the game plan for how that's going to happen. And Netanyahu is very focused on keeping his coalition together, on his politics. And so they were talking different languages, political languages. There's no doubt that, in my view, that there was a decision on the part of Netanyahu, and I think it's now been really exposed to play in our politics and to kind of lean into his relationship with the Republicans.
But in fairness, we do the same. I mean, there was no question that the Clinton administration wanted Ehud Barak to win, and Democrats want Labor to win.
I don't think there's any precedent for what we're seeing now, though. I think that this speech to Congress.
Are you outraged by it?
I am outraged by it, yeah. I am, and you know why? Because this administration has, despite all of the friction, been as supportive in terms of Israel's military needs, in military-to-military assistance, in standing up for Israel in international forums when people were trying to when other countries were trying to delegitimate Israel under some very difficult circumstances sometimes. All that support has been there, and to do an end run like that, and in a very partisan way, and then to do it in service of trying to undermine talks with Iran that may or may not prove out, but are an important benchmark on the way to whether or not that becomes a militarized kind of conflict or not. If you believe that that is not a good outcome, and we should at least try this. The other thing that by the way, just as an aside, I was with the president when we traveled all over the world, and he was talking to foreign leaders about the need to impose withering sanctions on Iran, and he did a masterful job of assembling an international coalition, which is why Iran's at the table now. Throughout that period, both from Netanyahu and some of the Republicans in Congress, there was ridicule about this strategy. It was a naive strategy. now they're saying, well, we need more sanctions. So, you know, the hypocrisy of that strikes me. But I think, you know, we have a deadline on March 24th in these negotiations, and the notion of coming here before that and trying to incite a vote that would undermine those negotiations, to me, is an unconscionable thing.
David, your specialty in politics, both running campaigns and within the White House, is communications. Should a president lie ever? Can a president lie in a campaign or in the White House? And are there gradations thereof? I'm asking, and I make no secret of it. I mean, you know, the New Yorker endorsed the fellow twice, and if anything, I'm accused of being too positive about Barack Obama. But I've in interviews asked him about his position on gay marriage, which changed. And I know for a fact, as you do, when he was a young state senator, he signed a questionnaire saying he was completely for gay marriage. This is 1990. When did he first run? 96. For state senate. And he's, let's just say, varied on that. And when I pose it, he wiggles out of it. And he said to you in the book, I'm just not a good bullshitter. But on the other hand, that's precisely what he was shoving.
Well, but you know what he would say, I can tell you what he would say in response to that.
Oh, I know what he would say.
All right, well, let me tell you what he would say. I know you know, but I want to tell you.
Okay, all right.
No, you know, look, there was never any question that he believed that gay and lesbian couples should have full legal rights. And he also was aware, because he represented a mostly African-American district, how fierce some of the opposition was, particularly among the clergy. He arrived at this position of civil unions on the theory that give gay and lesbian couples all the legal rights and you know, leave sacraments of marriage to the church. And he, over time, became uncomfortable. I think there was no doubt that was a compromised position about a reality. He thought that you could achieve, but I think just in terms of the issue itself, I think he thought you might be able to achieve civil unions, hard to achieve gay marriage. And he knew that it would be used as a cudgel.
But this is what I'm asking you as a principle in terms of communications, which interests me. In other words, I think he was signaling to the likes of me, to sort of, you know, left-leaning Americans and many others, you know I'm for it. I'm using a certain kind of language to signal that I'm for it. But if I say I'm for gay marriage prior to an election, I could lose the state of fill in the blank, Florida, Ohio, whatever the hell that was. Is that a moral choice, a political choice, and how does that work?
I think that, well, no, first of all, I don't characterize that as lying. I don't characterize that as lying. I don't feel that he lied. But I think the nature of politics is such that every great political leader that we've ever had has made those kind of judgments. Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt.
No doubt.
And that, you know, the question is, you know, Roosevelt was masterful at this. You know, we all know, you know, his maneuvering before World War II and so on to put us in a posture when the country was in an isolationist mood. So did he lie in World War in 1940?
Lincoln did about emancipation.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's part, but the question is, at the end of the day, are you driving towards something? I was in the White House when this president, very early on, called in the military and said, we're going to end Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and I need you to work with me on it. And he got that done. He was the one who said, we're going to withdraw from the DOMA suit, and led to the dissolution in the courts of DOMA. There was no doubt in my mind what he was working to. And ultimately, he said to us in 2011, because there were people who still were uncomfortable within our councils about him coming out for gay marriage, felt that it might hurt him in some battleground states. And in 2011, he finally said to us, you know what, if I get asked the question, if I were a legislator in Illinois where they were considering these issues, would I vote for gay marriage? I'm going to say yes, so you guys just better get ready for that. And ultimately, he made his declaration. So when he talks about an evolution, there was an evolution, and it's very much in the tradition of American politics as practiced by some of the most effective leaders we've ever had.
In the same mode, and we've noticed, well, he suffered a terrible defeat in the midterms, the recent midterms. Then it doesn't go unnoticed that in the State of the Union address, at least rhetorically, he really gets his mojo back in some sense. He is himself, or what one believed to be himself, and not unhinged is the wrong word, but kind of. He just
there were some people in the audience who were unhinged.
There was, but and one of the surprises, and something he certainly couldn't say in 2008, maybe even for the last election, was that I am going to make it all happen with Cuba. And this was something that went on in secret at the direction of Ben Rhodes and others, and it happened. What else is in store? There's less than 2 years left, and TikTok, and it's well known that in the last year of a presidency, it's even more complicated. In your mind,
if that's possible.
Yeah. In your mind, you know that the avenues of legislation, major legislation, are almost completely shut off.
There are some areas in which you can do something.
There are some. But where are the big plays that you as an idealist want to see happen now that you're out?
Yes.
What do you want to see happen? What do you want your president to do between now and January 20th, about 2 years?
Well, let me just say, make a few points on your question. First of all, it is an interesting phenomenon. I mean, the media environment today is more complicated than it's ever been for any president. There is no more bully pulpit. There is this really kind of debilitating kind of a theory in the media that every day is election day, every story is the most decisive story of your administration because they're all fighting for eyeballs. Tough environment. So we lose, or he loses the midterm elections badly, and literally people are reading last rites over the administration. And then in subsequent weeks, like 2 weeks later, I was on a program, and then he had done immigration reform. He had struck an agreement on climate change that could be very significant with the Chinese. And he had taken some steps on net neutrality. And, the announcer said, phenomenal muscular presidency and everything. This is 2 weeks after, in the same venue, we're discussing whether the guy should even show up for work anymore or just pack up and go home. So I've been exhilarated by what I've seen since the election, and Cuba as well. I think it was a great step forward. He's doing all these things that I know that he has in his own checklist of things
That's what I'm asking. What's the checklist?
Well, let me just say, two of them were laid out or foreshadowed in the steps that he already took. One of them is to try and do as much as possible on climate change. The step with the Chinese may open the door to a global agreement that has been elusive. That could be really significant, and he's got steps that he can take through the EPA, and I suspect that he will. That will be really historic. I'm struck by, I was on a program, and I was asked, actually Joe Scarborough said, why is he working on climate change? The NBC Wall Street Journal poll says it's not in the top 5 issues people are concerned about. Now, I just had
They also said it was cold out.
I just had a beautiful grandchild, my first little girl named Malin in October, and I read a story around that time that said if we don't come to an agreement, the planet will be largely degraded by the end of this century. A number of scientists said, and I'm thinking about my granddaughter who's going to be alive at the end of the century, God willing, and am I supposed to say to her from the grave, is the president supposed to say from the grave, we would have done something about this, but the Wall Street Journal, NBC poll just wasn't very good, And so I think that's very important. I think he's set steps in motion here on immigration reform that are going to be hard to turn back. And I think the Republican Party, I know they are signifying for their base that they will try to do it. but I think they do so at their own peril. And my guess is that he's created a set of circumstances that will lead to a permanent solution, on this issue. That's really important to him. That was one of the great things he wanted to solve. And I think there are issues. He is interested in these rather significant trade treaties with Asia and Europe. We can discuss the basis for that, but there's an opportunity, I think, to get something done on infrastructure, which it's criminal that we've had the lowest interest rates, ever, and we've got this
build nothing.
All these infrastructure needs, and we haven't taken advantage of it. Get people back to work and develop a 21st century infrastructure we need to grow our economy. I think we might be able to get something done on that. Healthcare, obviously, we'll wait on the Supreme Court, but I think you want to continue to work on that. But the big issue I think the greatest issue of our time is the one he described in the State of the Union, and that is, how do we, as advanced economies and as our economy, create an economy in which people who work hard can get ahead, in which there's economic mobility again, in which we don't have these great disparities that are big and growing. We are in a new Gilded Age, and I think it's certainly unhealthy to the social fabric. It undermines the fundamental value that we associate with ourselves as Americans, that if you work hard, you can get ahead, and that you're not your destiny is not determined by where you were born or the circumstances in which you're born. And I don't think it's ultimately a good growth strategy either in an economy that's driven by consumer.
But you're been in the politics business. By the way, we're going to get some questions from you that are on cards, but no cards have been delivered, so whoever it is should do that. You're in the politics business, and you have seen firsthand, thank you very much.
Boy. You can
I ask and it happens.
Yeah. Now we know how the New Yorker runs.
You're damn right. You're in the politics business, and we talk about the plutocracy. We talk about the distorting aspect of money. Nothing happens. The Koch brothers are determined to give $900 million to the campaign. This is from one corporation, family, whatever the difference is. And Democrats have their own sources of, and yet no one went to jail for any of their activities, any serious activities in the crash of the economy some time ago. And the one or two times that the President of the United States dared to say something a little bit tough about fat cat bankers or something, the entire investment banking community was up in arms.
No, I still hear about it.
Oh my God.
I still hear about it. The masters of the universe, it turns out, are very sensitive.
They're very sensitive.
Yeah.
Who knew?
Yeah. No, I know. Believe me, after I left the White House, I went on the speaking circuit.
Tougher, yeah.
I went on the speaking circuit, and a lot of the organizations that pay for you to speak are financial organizations, because, as we mentioned, they have a lot of money. Yeah. And I used to call it pay to flay. I would show up, and they would flay me. But we always had this, it always came down to, he called us names. It was like stunning to me. And the other was the complaint about, overregulation. And I used to ask the question wherever I went, how many here, I just want to show of hands, believe that the crisis we had in 2008 came because we had too much regulation? Mm-hmm. And of course, nobody would raise their hand. But getting back to your question, I think part of the problem in terms of prosecution, and I'm not a lawyer, there are probably plenty of them in this audience here who would fill out a card and correct me when I say that. But part of the problem was we didn't really have laws in place on to curb some of the abuses that we saw, and that was why financial reform was so important. But I think one of the most difficult things we faced when we got there was that in December 16th of 2008, before we ever got there, we had a meeting, our first meeting with our economic advisors, and Christy Romer, who was coming in as the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, who was an expert on the Great Depression, said, Mr. President, and this was like the first time I heard people referring to him as Mr. President, which in and of itself was bracing. She said, Mr. President, this is going to be the deepest economic crisis since the Great Depression. Larry Summers said, we're going to lose millions of jobs, huge hole in output, and we could face, he was the one who said we have a 1 in 3 chance of a second Great Depression. Tim Geithner spoke and said the banks are locked up, they're not lending, and the financial system could collapse. And then to cheer everybody up, Peter Orszag, the budget director, said, and by the way, this is going to add trillions of dollars to the deficits. That was the situation that we faced. And
that was the point when Obama said, I guess it's too late for a recount.
Yeah, he said, I think it's too late. Exactly. So he said, we better figure out what we're going to do here. And then the Recovery Act started being planned in that room. But he had to make a series of decisions, each of which were as unpopular as they were necessary. One of them was to shore up the banking system. And nobody was that eager for that. We shared outrage about, at least I did, I know he did, about the abuses that led to this. He actually came here in 2007 and made a speech at NASDAQ in which he warned about these excesses and where they would lead. So this was not new ground for us, but we had to do it because if the financial system did collapse, then we would be hurtled into a second Great Depression. And so, what bothers me is he made these tough decisions. The other was, by the way, to intervene and save the American auto industry, which people didn't want him. I mean, the public was opposed to that. Very dramatic decision on his part. Talk about that in the book and how that all came about. What bothers me is, it seems to me the financial community is doing pretty well now. Now, we did get our money back, which was good. And I think that, I know Tim Geithner, and maybe in this room, has his detractors, but the system that was set up did work. The stress tests, the recapitalization, and we got the money back. And I would venture to say if Europe had done the same thing when we did it, they would be in better shape today. What bothers me is the ingratitude. The ingratitude. I mean, the American people rode to the rescue of the financial community, and they are outraged because the president called them names. Mm-hmm. And, the sense of entitlement there is extraordinary to me.
David,
I didn't say it quite that way when I was speaking at those events, but...
I understand. We'll show them a videotape. Are political dynasties bad for American politics? I ask coincidentally, because...
No, look, I'm as concerned about Rand Paul and Ron Paul as you are.
I'm not letting it go with that.
All right, it was worth a try.
Yeah. We have a very likely, as everybody in the room knows, we have a very likely political race in 2016 of Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush. A third Bush, a second Clinton. Is that okay, or is it Latin America in the 50s?
Well, I have, these same concerns caused me to oppose John Quincy Adams, actually, when he ran for president. First of all, I don't know how likely that matchup is, because I think the Jeb Bush campaign is a really interesting experiment.
In what?
In the sense that he seems committed to stick to his position on immigration reform, which is anathema to the core of the Republican Party. He seems committed to sticking to his position on education reform, which is anathema. They now call it the Obama core. Mm-hmm. The right wing does. They're so clever. But he seems committed to it. I think he's seen what I've seen, which is that you've had center-right Republicans in the last two elections, Romney and McCain, who sacrificed their center-right credentials and made a Faustian bargain with the right wing of their party in order to be the nominee, thus rendering themselves unelectable. Now, they may have lost anyway, but that was a big problem. Jeb Bush is saying, I'm going to run, I'm going to take these positions, and I'll either lose the nomination or I will win the nomination in a way that I can run in a general election. I think that's a very big bet he's making, and I'm not sure how it's going to turn out. But let's assume the premise of your question. I think that it is a fact of life that you acquire in public life equity over time, and there's equity in the Clinton name, there's equity in the Bush name. But here's what I would, and I know that I've heard it from people I'm close to, gee, I'm tired of all this. Here's what I believe. When the election,
How close?
When the campaign, well, I don't want to bust anybody here, so I'm not going to say.
Okay.
But people in this room.
I see.
Okay. But you know who you are. But here's what I believe. I think once the campaign begins, the campaign's going to be less about this and more about what they have to offer as leaders. And when these candidates get out there, and we're not talking about names in a vacuum, the campaign's going to be about ideas. And whoever has the most compelling and whoever speaks, I think, to this notion that I've been speaking about how we create an economy in which we actually honor the value of hard work and have a middle class and have the notion of upward mobility and do something about inequality. I think that people will become engaged in that fight. I'm less concerned about where these candidates came from than where we're going as a country. And I'm looking for a good, healthy debate about that, and hopefully around this issue.
You poured your heart and soul into a campaign in 2008 against Hillary Clinton. You write extensively and really interestingly about that campaign. It's a fascinating part of the book. And there's no question when you're involved in a battle like that, a prolonged, consuming, ideological, political battle, you take on a certain emotional valence against the other side. The very, very likely Democratic nominee, if she chooses to run, and it seems more and more likely that that's the case,
yes.
will be Hillary Clinton.
Yes.
Now, how do you face that in 2016?
Well, look, I mean,
hang on. And what rationale?
Isn't that freighted enough?
What's not? You got to load the fruit truck on with more bananas. What's the rationale for her running? That's what you went after in 2008 quite successfully.
I agree with that, and I've said publicly that the problem she had in 2008 was that the candidacy got out in front of the rationale for it. And I've noted, and by the way, Hillary Clinton was a friend of mine long before 2008. I worked for her when she ran for the Senate in 2000. She's been a patron saint of CURE, the organization that my wife Susan founded to help fund epilepsy research. So there are long-standing ties there. And I would correct one thing that you said. I didn't run a campaign to defeat Hillary Clinton. I ran a campaign to elect Barack Obama.
But it's pitched battle.
It was a pitched battle, but that my motivation wasn't to stop Hillary Clinton. My motivation was to elect Barack Obama. The truth is the differences between them on issues was not very great. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a big ideological battle between them, and that's often the case in primary elections. It became a battle, yes, over Iraq and over a style of politics that at the time called for the qualities that Barack Obama brought after George Bush. But I think for Hillary Clinton to be successful in this campaign, she is going to have to articulate a vision and the rationale for her candidacy coming out of the box.
Can you anticipate what that'll be?
I think it will be around these economic issues. I heard her make a great speech up in Philadelphia during the midterm elections for Tom Wolf, who got elected governor up there, that dealt directly with these issues that I've raised here. And I will say this, it was really striking to me running in this campaign in 2007 and 2008, I've said oftentimes that she was not a very good candidate in 2007 because she was weighed down with this heavy, heavy weight of inevitability, and she was therefore very cautious, very cautious. When we won the Iowa caucuses, she became a much different candidate, threw her caution off, related to people in a much more visceral and authentic way, was much more revealing of herself as a person, and scared the hell out of us, frankly, for 5 or 6 months. I also then got to see her as Secretary of State. One of the interesting stories about the Obama administration is how well they worked together and how much respect they showed to each other when she was there. So yes, we had as you say, a pitched battle, but that battle doesn't define his relationship with her, nor does it define my attitude toward her.
David, I can't help but ask about this as a consuming interest of mine. It has been from the start of this, and that's about race and Barack Obama.
Yeah.
So
I think you wrote a book on it.
I did,
Yeah.
and
this is how David expresses
time,
his consuming interests.
Every time people ask him about this, he would rather you ask about, you know, North Korean films or anything in the universe.
Or what North Korea does to our films.
What they, North Korean film critics.
Yes.
And he has a stock answer. I'm sure there are some people that don't like me because I'm black, but on the other hand, da, da, da,
Yeah, right.
And you just know,
right,
because you know him well,
yes.
I know him a little bit, that this is a very practiced, very calibrated answer that says just enough. In about 2 years, Barack Obama will, according to the agent Andrew Wiley, sign a contract for, forgive me, the biggest contract for a nonfiction book ever. And probably Michelle Obama will come close.
I can't believe my record's going to get broken that quickly.
It'll happen to Bob Beamon, it happened to you. What will we learn more about the way he has processed this phenomenon, day after day, of being the first African American in office? How does he process the nastiness of the opposition to him? What do you know that he won't reveal? Take a few dollars off his book advance.
Yeah. No, I wish him well. I'm just hoping to get a few crumbs off his table here. Look, I wrote about this in this book, and I acknowledge that I gave the same answers. I was very much unwilling to engage in that discussion because I didn't want to communicate a message that somehow we thought all his political problems were the result of race. And I knew that would be the chorus from the opposition. But look, no other president has had a member of Congress stand up and shout, "You lie," in the United States Congress. No other president has faced persistent, ridiculous questions about his citizenship. There are things that were done to Barack Obama that would not have been done to another president.
Bill Clinton would argue with you.
No, Bill Clinton, well, because he was the first black president, I know. But look, Bill, look, I think that there is, what Clinton endured incredible nastiness when he was the president, and there's no question about it. And there's a lot of, and frankly, George W. Bush absorbed a lot of bitterness as well. I don't think that bitterness in our politics is new. I think no one ever stood up and shouted, "You lie," during a presidential speech when Bill Clinton was president. Nobody questioned his citizenship or his Americanism in the way that they have this president. So I think, with all due respect to President Clinton, who did endure a lot, I think there are unique elements of this, and I think it's because there are people in this country who see the changing face of our country, the diversity, the growing diversity of our country, and some of the cultural changes that come with that. And they look at that with fear. I look at it with enthusiasm. I think we've always been a country that's evolved in that way. It's one of the strengths of our country. But there are people who don't share that view. There have been nativists in every generation. There were people who were unkind to my immigrant father and unkind to your family, I'm sure, at the time. And so, that is, and they see in Barack Obama a symbol of that change. And there is in their minds a question of the legitimacy of him in that chair. And anybody who denies that, I think, is ignoring what is plain to see.
David, where you get at this summit, the book, where has Barack Obama disappointed you? That no president can fail to disappoint even his most ardent supporters.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to what I said before. I do think that I think he could have done better in terms of how he approached people he was trying to persuade in the political realm. Right. No doubt about that. I think, the strategic decision on the part of the Republican Party was what it was, and that wasn't going to change, but it was still, he could have done better there. The other thing, and this was more in my realm, is that Barack Obama believes that elections are one thing and governing is another. And that, the tools and the exercises of elections are for election campaigns. So the sort of sticking to a consistent theme day after day, driving a message in the way you drive it in a campaign is useful for campaigns in his mind. But when you're president, you have to deal with all these issues, and it cheapens the debate to try and reduce it to this one narrow theme. And we used to argue because at press conferences, in campaigns he learned the discipline of delivering message and very quickly in his answers. In press conferences, as president, some of those answers could go on, like you could go out and grab a sandwich and come back for the end of the answer. And oftentimes the most important part of the answer would be in the back, because he'd be building to that. And that's, you need campaign skills. You need to apply your campaign skills even to that, to governing, in order to maximize your chances of success. And, it showed up in, even in the debate, in the first debate. He was just very resistant in the run-up to that debate to what is the demands of those events. Those presidential debates are not sort of spontaneous exchanges of ideas, right? They are.
You're kidding.
They are. I don't want to. Yeah, I know.
I'm disillusioned.
Yeah, this could be. This could be something for the New York.
Yes. 10,000 words.
But I mean, you say that, but the fact is that it wasn't that he didn't know that, but he resisted it. He resisted the the sort of.
That's what's so interesting in your book. You could see in the practice sessions he was no better than he was in the performance. You could see it coming.
No, we could see it coming, and we had a very testy exchange the night before the debate, which I think reflected more his frustration with himself in the process than it was with me, though I was the target of his ire. But it took an intervention before the second debate in which he acknowledged, look, I'm a lawyer. I was trained that way. I'm used to trying fact, and I'm treating these things like they're on the level. They're not on the level, and I understand that. It had nothing to do
with contempt for the opponent?
No. I mean, I think almost every president, and Clinton escaped it, every president generally has done poorly in the first debate because you're 4 years up on the pedestal. No one's this close as a peer challenging you the way they do in a presidential debate. And I think that some of that was at play there. But it also was him basically saying, you know what, this is kind of a stupid exercise, and I'm not going to play. Well, you know what, you got to play.
Yeah.
That's part of the deal.
Final question, and before Barack Obama ran for president, he was wandering around a hotel, I forget with whom. This is a story Doris Kearns Goodman told me. And their portraits of the presidents were up on the wall. And he said, maybe it was to her, I can't remember, it's in a certain book somewhere. And he said, I don't just want to get elected president. I want to be one of the very great presidents. So far in the early, ranking systems, as ridiculous as they may be, that's not where he's placed. And very rarely is a sitting president ever evaluated particularly accurately.
Yeah, or fairly.
Maybe George W. Bush was. I would, you are as partisan a person to ask this as possible, but we all know your bona fides. Where do you think that'll end up 5, 10 years
honestly,
from now?
I honestly believe this. And yes, I plead guilty. I have a high regard for him because he's a believer like I'm a believer, and that's why I was attracted to him. But when I think of where we were when he became president of the United States, an economy on the brink of collapse, 2 wars raging, 180,000 troops overseas, a healthcare system that was imploding, almost 50 million people uninsured, and that number growing, a financial system that had no 21st century regulations, discrimination against gays and lesbians in a really grotesque way, discrimination against women in the workplace in ways that were egregious, and a whole range of other things that are different today because of him and because of the decisions he made, and often decisions he made that were not from the political play, that people in Washington thought were bad decisions because they were politically fraught, and he was risking himself. When we took on health care, he said, I've done so many of these today, so tell me if I'm repeating myself. But this one's an important story. He said, I went to him with a polling, and I said, 7 presidents have tried, 7 have failed. It's very difficult, very risky. And he said, okay, I know. He said, but if we don't do it in the first 2 years, we're not going to get it done. And he said, and let me ask you something. He said, are we supposed to just put our approval rating on the shelf and admire it for the next 8 years? Or are we supposed to draw down on it to do something that's going to make a long-term difference for the country? And, I always say I like him so much because he listened to me so little. And that was a particularly important decision to me personally because I have a child with a chronic illness, epilepsy. My family was one of those families who almost went bankrupt when we were young parents. I knew what was wrong with the healthcare system. And even as I was giving him the political realities, I wanted to hug him when he said, I don't care about that.
We both share this. I have a child with autism, you with epilepsy, and as a parent, I think the most profound emotional part of this is knowing that you're psychologically not thinking about getting to the end of your own life, but you're responsible for getting your child to the end of his or hers. And mainly I'm talking in financial terms.
Right.
Did the healthcare success ensure that? Or do you think that healthcare went all the way for?
I think what healthcare did, look, there are programs that were already in place that are helpful in terms of supporting people with disabilities, in terms of some of those expenses. But this issue, and when my child got sick, she had started having seizures. They said it would pass. A month later, we were released from the hospital. She was still having 10 seizures a day. This went on for 19 years. And in those early years, my insurance was really inadequate, and we couldn't switch because she had a pre-existing condition and didn't cover a lot of out-of-pocket expenses. So I'm paying $10,000 or more out of pocket on a $38,000, $40,000 salary. And that, I think, will change for lots of families. And the night that healthcare passed, David, and I'll say this, and then I don't want to cheat folks out of answers to their questions.
We're covered.
The night healthcare finally passed after this, epic battle, we're standing in the, and I write about this, we're standing in the Roosevelt Room, which is the conference room adjacent to the Oval Office, and my office was right next to the president's office. president was there, the vice president, everybody who worked on the issue, and the votes were coming in the House, and it became clear that this was going to pass. And I got up and I went into my own office and closed the door, and I just sobbed. And I mean, I'm not talking, I mean big heaving sobs. Really surprised myself, and I was wondering why I was so emotional. And I realized, you know, I felt like because of what he had done, because of what we had done with him, that people wouldn't have to go through that nightmare that my family went through. And I collected myself and went and found the president, and I said, you know, I want to thank you on behalf of all the families who won't have to go through what my family went through. And he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, that's why we do the work.
David, thank you. Thank you all.